In today's In-Ear Insights, we're talking about Google Analytics for migration and how to know whether you've done it right, and in particular, if you've brought in a third party, how to know if they did it right. So, Katie, set the table. What are the concerns that you have about a lot of these, migration specialists that have sort of popped out of the woodwork, as you say?
Well, I mean, that's a lot of it is all of a sudden, I'm seeing everyone coming out saying, well, I can help you and I'm a specialist and I'm a specialist. And, I think that a lot of people can be knowledgeable in Google Analytics 4. It's new, but it's not new enough that people haven't been studying it and experimenting with it and playing with it. But I think that because it is so new of a system, it's harder for marketers to say, yes, this person knows what they're talking about, or no, this person is just going to take my money and set it up and say, I did what I was supposed to do. It's not my problem anymore if it's not working correctly, and sort of blame it on the website or something else. So what I wanted to understand from you, Chris, because I know the second Google announces anything, you jump on it and start to experiment with the new software, the system, the data, those kinds of things. So, you're the person I always sort of look to say, is this BS or not? So what I want to understand is, what are some things that marketers who have hired migration specialists, what can they look for to understand if Google Analytics 4 was set up correctly, other than it's collecting some kind of a data set? Can I expect a one-to-one match between my Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4, for example? Let's start there.
I would actually say that you have the better answer to this question than I do, which
oh dear,
may be a surprise to you.
It is. It is.
But here's why. Google Analytics 4 still fundamentally has to perform the functions of web and digital analytics, app analytics, things like that. How you know that you've worked with somebody who knows what they're doing is how much process time they spent with you up front, to understand your goals, to understand your governance, to make recommendations about your governance, to understand how you set things up, to get the history of what you've done in the past, to look in the existing account, ask questions like, well, why is this set up this way? Do you remember who set this up? And all that process and procedure up front means you're going to get a better instance when you're done. I would be extremely wary of somebody who says, okay, we're going to go in, we're going to take your Google Analytics 3, migrate all the settings to Google Analytics 4. You don't have to do anything, and we'll tell you when it's done. Because we both know there's a lot of things that are on the people and the process side that inform the platform. And if you don't do those things, then you're going to get, yes, a platform conversion, but you're not going to be better off, right? It's like, if I look at my furnace has a control panel, some knobs, dials, and buttons. It's not a super complicated piece of equipment, right? It's not like it's a rocket going into space. But at the same time, I don't know what the buttons do. And so I should probably not just go start tinkering with them without at least trying to read the manual. On the other hand, if, when the HVAC guys come in to tune it up, they ask questions like, are you happy with the water pressure? Are you happy with the water temperature? Does your shower get cold unexpectedly when someone flushes a toilet and stuff? And then they tune the system based on my needs. And what I say, here's what's going on. And that's the sign of good service, of somebody who understands a platform and how it applies to you, is they ask a lot of questions, even though it takes longer up front. That to me is another indicator that I'd be a little bit wary, is somebody saying, oh yeah, I'll be done in 24 hours. Like, okay, I mean, like, yeah, I can have somebody just change the oil in my car really quickly, but if there's something wrong with my car, I would like somebody with actual expertise to go, like, your front right tire has like no tread on it, and I don't want we're changing the oil, but that's kind of glaringly obviously wrong.
Yeah, I think if we take a step back for like a hot second, I think the term migration is also the incorrect term, because you're not, this was sort of the other piece that was bugging me about all of these migration specialists who suddenly appeared out of nowhere, is that you're not migrating the system. I feel like it's the wrong term, because to me that implies that you're moving everything from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4, when Google has said your data in 3, your in Universal Analytics, and your data in 4 are separate. They're different. And so it's not a migration. Yes, you can copy settings, but even the settings, the way it's set up is different. So you're really not migrating anything. You really are starting net new. And so you're exactly right, Chris. So if someone doesn't sit down with you and say, let's talk through how you use this system, let's talk through why it was set up this way in the first place, the things you want to change, how you want to do it differently now, it's a missed opportunity to get it right. Because what we know from working with a lot of clients on their Google Analytics is Universal Analytics was maybe set up one way like 5 years ago, but the business has evolved, the system hasn't evolved. So setting up Google Analytics 4 is an opportunity to evolve your data collection system with the needs of the business today, not the needs of the business 5 years ago. Even, we went through a revamp of our Google Analytics at the end of last year, and I wouldn't be surprised if we went through it again at the end of this year, having collected a year's worth of data one way, saying, does this work? Does this not work? Let's update it again. I'm already seeing room for improvement in our own data, and it's only been 3 months.
Exactly. And there is, obviously some very technical stuff that happens under the hood, like understanding which metrics translate to which just don't exist anymore. There's also technical pieces that don't translate over. For example, in GA3, there's this thing called custom task that allows you to send data, certain types of data into GA3. It doesn't exist in GA4. It's not there. So there are different workarounds. But those are typically very specialized cases, and that's part of that upfront audit and investigation, is to say, like, okay, there's these things that are in Tag Manager here. What are they for? Do you know what they're for? Do you know why they're there? Even just over the weekend, I was messing around with my martial arts teacher's GA4 account. He's a sole proprietor school. I mean, I do all of his stuff, pro bono, because he can't afford our services. But even just basic stuff like that, like things like putting your client ID or your session ID into GA4, because it's not there by default. You got to do it different ways. Now, there also will be things that you have to do your due diligence and ask, okay, like, what is this thing used for? So we make some customizations to our GA4 accounts and our clients' GA4 accounts based on stuff that we do. And we're actually going to have an entire toolkit of stuff that is, clients won't necessarily need it, but we will need that data in order to be able to build and use our services on those accounts. And so a big question when you're going in and looking at these accounts is like, okay, well, how was this set up? Why was this set up these ways? Things like storing all of your data. One of the things that we've been telling people is you need, if you want to be able to do multi-year lookbacks at a granular level, you need to do the BigQuery link. You need to copy your data, because Google Analytics has a maximum storage time in GA4 of 14 months for event level data. You'll still get roll-ups, year-over-year roll-ups, but you will not be able to drill down into data past 14 months unless you have the BigQuery integration turned on. And then you got to export the data from BigQuery and process it offline, because Google's not going to have that in the interface. So there are little technical things, but if a marketer doesn't have the technical background to begin with, then looking for them to determine if your migration was good or not will kind of be an exercise in futility. Better to say how much process was done up front, right? How much investigation and asking what your needs are. Because the other thing is, when you look at Tag Manager, for example, and the ways that you can do goals now, which are now called conversions, there are different ways to track those conversions now. There may be better ways than what has existed in the past, simply because you're now doing everything at the event level. And so that upfront deep dive should be, okay, well, how exactly, what exactly is a conversion to you in this new world? Do you have a mobile app? and then you start getting into who in your company is in charge of the mobile app and things like that. And so you'll get lots of rat holes to go diving into.
So you just hit upon I think the two things that, marketers, even if they don't have the technical understanding of how Google Analytics 4 works, that they can absolutely sort of look out for as terms of like red flags that the person that they've hired maybe, is shortcutting them. So one is, is there a BigQuery instance set up in order to export your data from Google Analytics 3, Universal Analytics, and also Google Analytics 4? Because what we know from what Google has told us is that your historic Google Analytics 3, your Universal Analytics data, will not be available forever. And so if you hire someone and they say, and if you ask them like, well, how do I access my data? And they just say, you can't, it's going to be gone, or, you can't export it, then that's a red flag. You should be able to get your data out and put it into BigQuery.
You can, I guess, use BigQuery as a storage mechanism, but to get your data out of GA3, you have to export it from the API and put it someplace else. It doesn't have to be in BigQuery, but it's not something you can do in the interface itself. BigQuery linking is only for Universal Analytics 360 and GA4. So the thing that people are asking, and which we can't do presently, is you can't take your existing data and put it into the new GA4 instance. It cannot happen.
Right. So I guess that's what I was saying. I wasn't saying you could just magically put everything together, but a good specialist, a consultant, should be able to help you get all of your existing data out of 3, put it somewhere, whether it's BigQuery, but also for Google Analytics 4, set up that BigQuery instance, because, Chris, to your point, the time limit in terms of which it stores the data does expire after 14 months in terms of that event level data. And so those are the kinds of questions you want to be asking is, well, how can I access my data long term? How do I get my historic Universal Analytics data? Can you help me export that out of the system? Because again, as Google said, like as of right now, it's only going to be available for 6 months after that cutoff date. And so how do you get that out? And then the other thing that, you can ask and look for in terms of the person that you're bringing on is about those goals. So Chris, you had mentioned that now in Google Analytics 4, goals, which are now called conversions, interchangeably, have to be event-based. And so if the person you bring on to help you set up this new system isn't talking to you about your goals and what they are and what they entail and how you use them and how do you convert them from whatever they are, destination to event, whatever the setup is, that's also a red flag.
Exactly. And if you're curious, go over on the Trust Insights YouTube channel. We actually have a 14-minute video on just how to set up a goal in GA4. So if that's something of interest, just head on over to the Trust Insights YouTube channel to go to trustinsights.ai/YouTube, and it's in our videos. The other thing that I'm seeing that's very interesting right now, and is more for advanced implementations, at least for the time being, is I'm starting to see people talking about exporting the data from GA3 into a different analytics system. So in one of the Slack groups that we're in, some folks are starting to look at the Matomo, the free open source software, and using a data importer to essentially take the data out of GA4 and put a GA3 and push into Matomo's database, which is really just a MySQL database on the back end. And that's very interesting, particularly for people like me, where I've got 14 years of Google Analytics data, and I don't want to lose access to it. If I can push that into an open source system, then it's mine forever, right? For as long as I continue to pay for the hosting for my database, I have my data forever. And so one of the things to look for in implementation consultants and stuff is to ask, okay, well, how do you handle situations like this? What's the process? Because again, even if you don't understand the technology, like if you don't know the difference between BigQuery and MySQL, it doesn't matter. The bigger question is, how does a service or an agency, whatever, address the questions that people are most likely to have, and how thorough are those answers? And are the answers that you would consider to be acceptable answers? Like you said, Katie, just telling somebody, nope, can't do that, sorry, is not the best answer. there will be resource constraints. Like, for example, if I was paying to have my GA3 instance moved to Matomo, it would probably cost me like 50 grand to do that, because you have to, get the converters, provision the databases, do all the, the translation stuff. But the joke we always say in sales, is the answer is never no. The answer is, how much are you willing to pay?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that sometimes the answer will be no, to your point, a resource constraint, but the person that you're working with needs to be able to explain to you why the answer is no, not just, nope, can't do it. And so, for example, if they say, nope, can't get your data out of Google Analytics 3, sorry, you're screwed. A quick Google search, a quick, internet search can tell you that it is possible, but Chris, to your point, it's going to take some work. And so, again, those are sort of things to like double check on. What other questions could marketers be asking about Google Analytics 4? What about things like Data Studio? Is it still a seamless integration between Google Analytics 4 and Data Studio? Like, so let's say, Chris, I came to you and I said, I have all these reports in Google Analytics 3. Can you just go ahead and replicate them using my new Google Analytics 4 instance? If you look at me square in the eye and go, yep, not a problem, I know you're lying.
It's true. The answer to that question is always, it depends. It depends on what reports you've got, what variables they use, what dimensions, what metrics. Because again, there are 520 dimensions in Universal Analytics, dimensions and metrics, right? Mm-hmm. There are 210 in GA4. There's 300 that Google did not port over for a variety of reasons. One, because they moved to the event model. Some metrics are no longer necessary. Like, for example, things like, the difference between hit scoped variables and session scoped variables and stuff is largely moot, because everything is an event now. So that changes the data model, the underlying data model. Mm-hmm. But more to the point, like I said, there are some things that just don't exist. And as a result, yes, you can replicate them in Data Studio, but you might have to do some very fancy footwork behind the scenes to make it happen. So, for example, pathing reports. There used to be these variables called previous page 1, previous page 2, previous page 3, etc., that would tell you the steps before a conversion in GA3. Those are gone. So if you had a report that was showing people, here's how the the pages before conversion happen, you can still do that, but you have to on the back end, outside of Data Studio, you need to write code that will take data out of BigQuery, summarize it, process it, group it by page and stuff like that, and then put that into a separate BigQuery table that then Data Studio can read the summary table and get the same effect. You will still get the same data, but the process to get the data is substantially longer and much less pleasant. Other reports, very simple ones, like how many visitors do we get this month? Yes, those are straightforward reports to well, actually, that's not true. The user summarization models changed too. So, for example, you will see active users and total users within the GA4 metrics and stuff. And so, depending on the use case and what you're trying to report on, you may want to use one or other of those metrics. The same is true for source medium. Source medium in GA3 was a session level variable. There are now 3 different sets of source mediums in GA4. So there's first a user acquisition source and medium, which is what is the source and medium that the user was first acquired by, regardless of the session. There's session source medium, which is the source medium for that session. And then there is source medium, which is the conversion source medium. So the source medium at the time of conversion. And so, depending on what you've essentially got there, is Google sort of almost baked in first and last touch into the GA4 data API itself, which is what shows up in Data Studio. But the question is then, are you trying to understand how you got the user? Are you trying to understand the last touch before conversion? Or are you trying to understand the impact of marketing, say at the session level, like what got somebody to come in that day? So again, like with GA4's analytics, a big part of the work with Data Studio is spending time up front talking to the user, asking them, what is this report supposed to do? What is the intent of this report? What decisions does it help you make? If you're trying to judge marketing effectiveness for traffic, you're going to use session source media. If you're trying to determine, sort of long-term user perspective, you're going to use first user source media. If you're trying to do that last touch within that conversion, you're going to use the conversion source media. So you've got 3 different ones. Again, depending on how fancy you want to get, you can actually, and this is something that we're looking at doing, is building our digital customer journey model using all 3 of those, essentially, to build a really nice multi-touch model that's a little faster. But in Data Studio, what's the variable? If you're doing e-commerce, oh my goodness, good luck to you. Because Google, like, literally last week just pushed in 22 new variables for e-commerce. We're like, why were these not in at launch? Like item price, like that seems like it should have been in at launch. So pro tip, by the way, if you are every time you load Data Studio, actually I'd say once a quarter, when you load Data Studio, go to your manage data sources menu, go to any existing data source and hit refresh fields, and you may be surprised at what new things appear, because Data Studio does not automatically do that.
So long story short, definitely Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4 are not a one-to-one in terms of the data that you are, presenting in Data Studio. So, that we now know. Another, question that you can ask, or another thing to look out for, is if your specialist or your consultant is not talking with you about UTM governance. So, Chris, you just talked through 3 different places where source medium are used. So it's not, just one, slap on a channel grouping and you're done. Channel grouping, as of right now, doesn't exist as a setting that you can tweak in Google Analytics 4. Therefore, you are 1,000% reliant on getting your source medium, your UTM tagging correct in order to understand where all of these, users and traffic is coming from. And if your specialist isn't talking with you about that governance and the proper way to do that, then that's also a red flag. Then that means that they are not aware that you can't reset the channel groupings. And even if you could, you still need good UTM governance, because resetting the channel groupings in the system does not guarantee 100% correct data.
Exactly right. The other thing, like, for example, other things that have gone in the opposite direction. One of the things that we've had to do in Data Studio reports in the past is write a query parameter filter. Because again, if you got a bunch of, a question mark and a bunch of stuff afterwards in GA3, that would create different page views for each of those things. It made things very, very messy. In GA4, Google does that automatically. So they now have page path, page parity with queries, page location. And so they've actually got like 5 different page variables now. So depending on the one you want to use, you don't have to have those special filters and edits and do that kind of governance in GA4 anymore. You actually can't do it. But in the data model, they've changed how they collect that data to avoid that problem. So again, it's one of those things where if you're trying to do a one-to-one from a previous Data Studio report to the current one, you got to be careful which of the variables you use, depending on things like your CMS. Like, we have one client that uses query parameters for their support forums, right? So they have these whole discussion boards and they have post ID and whatever. And in those cases, they would want to report on the query path parameters because it's different posts in their forums. Otherwise, it'll all just be one big blob. And for other customers, that's not the case. They want to get rid of those things so that they can get a summary view of just the pages on their website, because they don't use that in their CMS. So that's another case of how well does your implementation specialist know not GA4, but know your business and how you do things from a technical perspective. Like on the Trust Insights website, we don't use query path parameters except when we do. There are certain times where
Sure.
There are certain times we do. So like in some of our newsletters, we'll have a one-click poll. Just click the answer you want, and that will use a query path parameter. Most of the rest of the time, we don't. So depending on if we had a Data Studio report on the polls in our newsletters, we would want to use the page path with query. as the variable in Data Studio. Other times we just want the page path in Data Studio. And so it's very interesting inside the model how it works. Another thing that's kind of funky is in the old days, you would have to write a filter for GA4 to prepend the domain name. So it would be, /home would be what would show up in GA3, unless you made this filter edition. It would say www.trustinsights.ai/home. Now, because of page location, that's already built into GA4, so there's no need to have that filter in place because it's already in the data. So that, again, falls in the category of how do you use the product successfully if you've got multiple domains. If you're a company that has multiple domains, now knowing how the backend variables work, it's a lot less work to set up GA4 for good reporting on that than it is in the previous version. But you've got to know the customer's business.
So it sounds like really the bottom line is if you're looking to bring on someone to help you set up Google Analytics 4, they need to be spending time with you and getting those user stories, the business requirements, the technical requirements, understanding the goals, the KPIs. How do you use this? So anyone who says to you, yeah, sure, I can set it up exactly like Google Analytics 3 is set up, just give me a week and $5,000, you're going to get ripped off because they're not setting it up based on what you need today, and the systems are not one-to-one. The other thing that we didn't cover, we don't need to get into detail, is, if they say, okay, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and remove your universal analytics. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. You don't need that anymore. Stop what you're doing. Don't let them do that. You want to keep both systems running up until the point that Google says you can't, so that you can collect data in both systems to be doing that QA between the two.
Exactly. And again, one of the things we advise is have a third-party system, like the Matoma open source system or Plausible or any of the open source systems, just to fact check it, to make sure that A, the implementation is done correctly, and B, that you're getting mostly apples to apples with what's actually happened. If you're using a system like a CDN, like Cloudflare or Akamai, for example, they will have raw user counts as well, and you can see is there a dramatic unexplainable difference between the two. We happen to use Cloudflare, and there's actually a 4.5x difference between what Cloudflare sees and what Google Analytics sees. And the first time I dug into that, I'm like, whoa, that's a pretty big difference. And then I started digging in, and that huge difference is because of bots, garbage traffic. There's so much garbage traffic bouncing off of Cloudflare that we get a much better data quality up front. So again, that's one of those questions that a good implementation specialist is going to ask you. Say, okay, do you have a CDN or a reverse proxy server or something? If so, do you use it for measurement as well? And if you don't have one, you probably should. This is outside the scope of GA4, but from a data security perspective, I would be very uncomfortable if a company did not have some kind of upfront, DNS level CDN, so that your website itself was secure from people trying to hack into it and add pharmacy ads all over it. At the end of the day, the more time somebody spends getting to know, it's like going to the doctor, right? The more time a doctor or a nurse spends asking you questions and trying to get a complete picture of what's going on and running some diagnostics, the better diagnosis you're going to get. Can you imagine walking to the doctor's office? He looks at you for 2 seconds, goes, okay, we'll go schedule your surgery for the 7th. You're like, whoa, what? No. What's going on here? That's just not how that works.
Well, I mean, if your leg is hanging on by a tendon, then yeah, probably. He can probably just look at you and just know. But yeah, you're right. For the most part, you want someone who's going to spend some time getting to know you, getting to know your business, getting to know your goals. So that really is the key to understanding if the person that you're working with is setting things up correctly. So that's sort of the first part. And then we've talked through some of the technical things that you can be looking for to see if things were set up correctly or not. And so, good news, if you're looking for help, that's something that Chris and I do. And we will be happy to spend time with you, learning about your business, understanding your user stories, challenging you on really defining measurable KPIs. We're happy to do all of that stuff. And then Chris will then tinker with everything and set it up and make it all nice, and you don't need to worry about it.
The other thing I forgot to mention is look for, ask what the checklist looks like, for the migration. Like, we have a long ass checklist of stuff. I'm just reading through it here. So like, it's section 3 of the checklist is called the legal and shit section. It goes, does the authorizing party have legal right to accept DPA and other binding agreements? If no, flag those that, the implementation is blocked until that's done. What is the data retention period required? What agreements govern the company? GDPR, CCPA, CPRI, PIPL. What is the NAICS code for the industry and the industry? What additional legal constraints? FFIEC, FERPA, etc. So there's a whole section in our checklist of just the legal stuff that you need to have in place in order to do a migration properly. Because if somebody goes in and just checks yes to everything, they are signing legal agreements on your behalf with Google that your legal team may not necessarily want you to be doing. So even something like that is a procedural thing that needs to happen. And that's, again, part of the process. I think I would leave with this. GA3, which has been around in some form really since 2005, really was intended and engineered for small to mid-sized businesses, right? It has been sort of the small business's best friend. GA4, when you look at the architecture and how it's implemented, really is a mid-sized enterprise product. Even if it's being positioned as for everybody, the reality is, like with my martial arts teacher, it's not for small business. The complexity of it makes it very difficult for a small business to get up and running. And so the processes and procedures and governance and due diligence you have to do upfront to set up these two systems is different. You don't have to do a lot of upfront with my teacher's martial arts school. He just needs to know how many people visited the website. That's it. The due diligence that you need to do to make GA4 work well, be in compliance and stuff, is enterprise level. And so you want to make sure that the folks that you're working with, whoever you choose, has some experience with that and has some experience walking you through what enterprise level governance looks like.
All right. Well, lots to look for. Make sure whoever you're bringing on, you are doing your due diligence and checking them out and asking them questions. And then make sure that they are, in exchange, asking you just as many questions about your business.
Exactly. And if you have questions of any kind about this, pop on over to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 2,300 other marketers completely did not notice my April Fool's prank. But no, you're asking and answering questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.